Brilliant. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you could all be here today. I'm Beth, she, her pronouns from Book Group Services here at MCPL, and I'll be your MCPL staff facilitator. Some best practices for this program are we ask that you stay muted during Doug's presentation. Feel free to put questions or comments in the chat. I will be monitoring. And this will be recorded for archival purposes. For those who have checked out physical copies from the Booktalk collection, I will be monitoring your due dates, and please feel free to email me at booktalk@mymcpl.org if you have any questions. And now, without further ado, I'd love to introduce Doug Richardson of the National Park Service. Doug has celebrated his 30th year with the National Park Service and has served at 8 national parks in 4 states. Almost 34 years ago, he decided to study history and history education in college, in part inspired by the writing of David McCullough. He has been at the Truman home since January 2017 and started developing programming with Mid-Continent weeks after his arrival. Truman has always been his dream park, and in part because of the book we are discussing today. He and his wife are staunch believers in the library, and yes, his wife made him say that last line. So without further ado, take it away, Doug.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much. And thank you to Mid-Continent Public Library for allowing us to be part of this program series. My name is Doug Richardson, one of the rangers here at Harry S. Truman National Historic Site. And yes, thank you for being with us on this journey, this guided tour of Truman, month 9. And this is part of our journey of exploring this massive, wonderful biography of our 33rd president of the United States. And to use the baseball analogy, in our guided tour of Truman, we are rounding third base and we are getting very close to home. And our objective with this program is to make our way through the life and times of Harry S. Truman via this book. And we are almost there, my friends. And this program series is brought to you by the National Park Service, Harry S. Truman National Historic Site, and our good friends at Mid-Continent Public Library, using resources with our friends at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum at the National Archives as well. And this is dedicated to the memory of our late and dear friend, David G. McCullough. You'll see him there in that photograph on the right, hard at work in the research room at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum there in the 1980s, at work bringing this book to life. So here we are in the second term of President Harry S. Truman's administration. And Truman begins this particular chapter by talking about the health of President Truman. And so I wanted to begin by sharing with you some documents from the papers of President Truman's physician, Dr. Wallace Graham. And so indeed, maybe some of you with us today are physicians, and quite honestly, I am not. So I really have no idea what really any of these things mean. I thought maybe some of you might. Well, let me go back. Maybe you might be able to see what some of these things mean. Maybe you can see what some of these ECGs mean. But generally, President Truman's health wasn't all that bad. You can see he was 5'9", 175 pounds. His blood pressure, 125/80. Normal. Generally, he wasn't in bad health. January 19th, 1951. Generally, looks good. Now, towards the end of President Truman's presidency, his height, of course, didn't change. His weight generally stayed the same. Now, President Truman towards the end of his presidency, put on a few more pounds, but generally throughout his presidency, his weight stayed generally that same, and his blood pressure stayed the same. Amazingly, throughout the almost 8 years of his presidency, people remarked how President Truman just basically stayed the same. People remarked how throughout the almost 8 years of President Truman's administration, how he basically physically barely changed at all. And people remarked how the presidency really didn't seem to affect President Truman a whole lot. But some people who knew Truman really well were able to tell how it really did affect President Truman a bit. And last time you remember, we talked about Key West and how Key West was able to help take that blood pressure down a little bit. So we could understand how the presidency can affect a human being. And if we had the ability to talk to any inhabitant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we do know that pressures of the presidency really does affect a human being and anybody who lives and works at the White House. And it certainly did affect Harry Truman more than he certainly let on. But the papers of Dr. Wallace Graham are part of the National Archives, and they are absolutely fascinating. On page 860 of David McCullough's book, there's a very interesting story about how, as part of the Korean conflict, a gentleman, Sergeant First Class John Rice, was killed in Korea while leading his 1st Cavalry Division. He was killed in action. But just as Sergeant Rice was about to be interred in Sioux City, Iowa, once he was determined, once it was learned that he was not a white individual, his interment was stopped because that cemetery was for whites only. When President Truman learned of this, he was absolutely infuriated. When Sergeant Rice's wife had made the arrangements, she was not aware of the caveat that that particular cemetery in Sioux City, Iowa, was for whites only. Well, the newspapers, some of them, and one of them I included here, even some of the newspapers were really nonplussed at this. President Truman, with the assistance of one of his friends, General Harry Vaughn, stepped in and arranged for Sergeant First Class John Rice to be buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery on September 5th of 1951. And I wanted to share with you a photograph from the rites at Arlington National Cemetery, September 5th of 1951. And the photograph there at Arlington National Cemetery, and you'll see Sergeant Rice's mother there. And I wanted to share with you the telegram from General Vaughn to the mayor of Sioux City, Iowa, saying that the arrangements that President Truman made personally for Sergeant Rice for Arlington National Cemetery from Major General Harry Vaughn, made on behalf of President Harry Truman. Much is made about Harry Truman as being one of the leaders in civil rights. But not much is talked about what Harry Truman did in the way of civil rights on behalf of Indians and Native Americans. And the story of Sergeant John Rice is a good example of that. What I would encourage everybody to do on the Truman Library's website, www.trumanlibrary.gov, there is a section on the website where if you go to online collections, there is a wonderful little subsection there on Truman and civil rights and Native Americans. And you will see just a wonderful collection of documents on just what the Truman administration did and tried to do when it came to civil rights and Native Americans. And it's a wonderful, wonderful collection of documents. And again, when President Truman learned of the circumstances around the denying of Sergeant Rice in Sioux City, Iowa, Truman acted. And there's a photograph of Sergeant First Class John Rice, 1914 to 1950. And today we remember, and it's appropriate as we get close here to Veterans Day. And as we get close to Veterans Day, I wanted to share with you a brief silent film taken by an American soldier who was in Korea. This film, circa 1951 and 1953, its exact date is unknown. It shows the Korean countryside, and it is courtesy of the soldier, Charles Sperlin, digitized recently by the amazing audiovisual archivist at the Truman Library. Very grateful to the soldier, Charles Sperlin, and the Truman Library archivist. They're amazing. And it gives just a very fascinating perspective of the Korean countryside and the local residents going about daily life. And I just wanted to show this to you today. It's a very interesting perspective that perhaps we've never really thought about. And it's a silent film. Very grateful to the soldier, Charles Sperlin, and grateful to the staff of the Truman Library for digitizing this and preserving this film for future generations. So, how do you solve a problem like Joseph McCarthy? And that's something that President Truman was wrestling with. For nearly 10 years, President Truman had served in the United States Senate. And President Truman was wrestling with how to deal with Senator McCarthy. And it's really clear that President Truman's first instinct was to go out and really be a pugilist. But also at the same time, Truman really thought that the Senate would take care of its own. And so there is this letter that I came across from August of 1951, where he sent this letter to the ambassador to Chile, where he saw that there was this resolution in the Senate to expel McCarthy. And he really thought that the Senate, his old body, which the Senate has long had its nickname of being the greatest deliberative body in the world, where he thought that the United States Senate, his old stomping grounds, Truman's old stomping grounds, the body that he knew and he loved so dearly, where he thought the United States Senate, his old colleagues, would take care of the problem and self-regulate itself. There's a resolution in the Senate now to expel McCarthy for its actions. I don't know whether it will get anywhere, but it shows there is an awakening to the situation with which we are faced. Will it work? Stay tuned. Where does the buck stop? You read in this particular chapter that Harry Truman was the subject of a lot of controversy, scandals in the Internal Revenue Service, scandals with 5%ers, scandals with people receiving deep freezers, including one that was installed here at 219 North Delaware Street in the basement. Scandals involving Korea, involving politics and resignations. Where does the buck stop? Other presidents had the problems. Ulysses Grant's administration had all sort of problems with corruption. So did Warren Harding's. But as in the case of Ulysses Grant's administration, Grant himself was not corrupt. In the case of Warren Harding's administration, now, Warren Harding, personally, yes, there were problems with extramarital affairs, but Warren Harding himself was not on the take, but some of his cabinet officials were. But in the case of the Truman administration, there were problems again with the IRS and the 5%ers and such. Where does the buck stop? If you've ever taken a tour of 219 North Delaware Street, or if you haven't, please come and do so. When you do so, you have the opportunity to take a step into the Truman study, their library. And in the family study, that's where so many visitors love to stop and absorb and make a very deep intellectual and emotional connection. Visitors love that room. And one of the reasons that so many visitors love to do that is because you are faced with almost wall-to-wall shelves with thousands of books, and some books that are just so old, some books that belong to Bess Wallace Truman's father, books of all types. But one of the most interesting books in the Truman Home book collection in that study is one that, when you step into the Truman Home study, is immediately to your right. You would have to sort of turn your neck almost immediately to the right. It has a black spine, and it's simply called the Truman Scandals. And it's a rather critical look at the Truman administration. And it talks about all of this, the IRS scandals and 5%ers, and very critical of Harry Vaughn and all of this. What we don't know is how this critical book made its way into 219 North Delaware Street. Who gave the book to the Trumans? Did the publishers send a copy to them? Do we know if the Trumans read it? There are no notes in the book. Sometimes President and Mrs. Truman read these books and made notes. Sometimes the president made notes in the margins saying what crap or bunk, things like that. But there are no notes that I've ever seen inside of the book. I would love to know, did the president sit and read this book, and what did he think of it? We don't know. But every time I look at that book, I wonder, how did it get here? Who brought it? Who gave it? So next time you're in 219 North Delaware Street, just when you're in the study, poke your head around that corner or ask the ranger or volunteer who's giving the tour to point out the Truman Scandals and take a look at it and wonder. So, yes, indeed, the first quarter of 1952, Harry Truman surprised the political world at the Jefferson-Jackson dinner.
President and Mrs. Truman returned from a 20-day Key West vacation to the rebuilt White House. They're back at the executive mansion after almost 4 years, and the press asked Mr. Truman, who has a new key to the place, just how long he and Mrs. Truman plan to remain in the White House. But it's not till the Jefferson-Jackson dinner 2 nights later that Mr. Truman, entering the National Guard Armory in Washington here, speaks about his plans. 5,000 Democrats at the $100 a plate affair, including Mrs. Truman and National Chairman McKinney, hear the president praise the Democratic Party's record. Then, almost casually, while discussing that record, he lets loose some explosive news.
Whoever the Democrats nominate for president this year, he will have this record to run upon. I shall not be a candidate for re-election. I have served my country long, and I think efficiently and honestly. I shall not accept a renomination. I do not feel that it is my duty to spend another 4 years in the White House. We must always remember the things the Democratic Party has done and the high ideals that have made it great. We must be true to its principles and keep it foremost in service of the people. If we do that, we can be sure that there will be a Democratic president in the White House for the next 4 years.
Here in Truman's own hand is the farewell note that set Americans talking all over the country. On New York.
And indeed, if you notice the very happy First Lady to the right of the President of the United States, who had stunned the attendees at the Jefferson-Jackson dinner. Harry Truman had told the world that we were going to go home to Independence, Missouri. The race was on. And indeed, after several years of living at Blair House, the president and the first lady had gone home to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and every president since has given thanks to Harry Truman. Truman had saved the White House, and it's often forgotten how controversial that was. That, first of all, that Truman saved the White House. There were some who thought that the White House should have been just torn down and replaced, but to Truman, there was no question that the White House should be saved. It was part of America, that it was part of our identity. Now, by our standards, some preservation standards of today, we wince and we cringe a little bit by some of the decisions that were made, that some of the molding, some of the door frames, some of the hardware and such were thrown away and put into landfills. Bricks were sold for fundraisings. Yeah, we cringe a little bit at that, but we think of the big picture that 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was saved. We have the White House today. The White House today in 2023 is part of our national identity, that every president since has called the White House home. We can thank Harry Truman for that. So, Jacqueline Kennedy is often called the first person to give a tour of the White House. And she did do a wonderful tour of the White House, but she wasn't the first. And so today I wanted to really highlight the first tour of the White House, and it was done by Harry Truman. So thanks to the archives of NBC News, I wanted to share with you the first tour of the White House. And here's your tour guide.
This room is one of the three oval rooms, isn't that right, Mr. President?
Yes, the diplomatic reception room on the ground floor, and the blue room and my study on the second floor are all oval rooms. It's a beautiful room, this room is. And this point right here is where Mrs. Truman and I stand when we have state receptions.
Mrs. Truman on where I am or on your left?
Mrs. Truman's stands where you are. And just the other evening, we stood here and shook hands with 1,539 people by count. The diplomatic reception.
They can come through the door on your left and out into the red room.
That's right.
Door over here.
And then go on into the dining room and have some cookies and punch and then go away.
How many of the names of people in a line that long can you normally remember, Mr. President?
Well, ordinarily, you take the congressional receptions and the judicial receptions. I know them all, and I remember them all, but in the diplomatic reception, there are people from all over the world, and I didn't remember very many of the names. Of course, I knew all the ambassadors, but that's about all.
What about the furniture in this room, Mr. President?
This furniture in this room was purchased by James Monroe in Paris when Jefferson was president. It's the only really antique furniture that's left. Of course, it's been upholstered time and again. And the clock here on the mantel was brought back here by James Monroe when Jefferson was president.
Can we take a closer look at the clock, Mr. President?
Yes, it's a beautiful clock. And it still keeps good time.
Is there any, I guess is that Minerva? I believe I've heard of a Minerva clock. Is that the Minerva clock, Mr. President?
I don't know. I can't answer you, Frank. That's either Minerva or I'm sure that is Pallas Athene.
Uh-huh. Do all these clocks run, Mr. President?
Yes, they all run.
In every room.
We have a special man winds clocks every Friday.
How about the hangings in this room, Mr. President? Of course, if our people could see the color, they'd see it was all blue. Has it always been a blue room?
Oh, no, it hasn't always been a blue room. That red
couch down in the China room. Used to be in this room, and they had red furniture in here. But ever since I can remember, I think as far back as Cleveland's administration, it's been the blue room. And President Cleveland was married in this room.
Oh.
The only president to be married.
The only president to be married in the White House.
That's right.
Mr. President, wasn't it this ceiling that first began to tremble when you decided the White House needed to be renovated?
Yes, this is, my study is right over this, and I had a tray brought to me for luncheon one day. I was here by myself. The family were at home, and the floor bounced up and down, and I had an engineer and an architect to come in, and they moved me out.
And that was the beginning of the renovation.
Of the disintegration.
Is there anything about this chandelier up here, Mr. President?
No, I don't know that these chandeliers nearly all have been presented. Some of them since we've been here, some of them before. Some of the most beautiful chandeliers in the White House were taken down to the Capitol building and are still there. I tried to get them back, and they wouldn't let me have them.
You might take a look at the green room, the next room, Mr. President. The blue room, incidentally, which we just left, you said is under your study. That means it's under the more or less famous balcony that you had built out there. Is that correct?
Well, the balcony goes around the outside of it.
What is the green room used for, Mr. President?
This is for diplomats are received when they first come, and where they usually pay their respects when they go to leave the country. It used to be a dining room in the old days, but that is up to Van Buren's time, I think. Mm-hmm. We have 4 presidential pictures in this room.
Could we move over here and take a look at this one on our left over here?
Jefferson's on the west wall. John Quincy Adams is on the east wall. And I was telling you a while ago about the old Chesapeake and Potomac Canal that interfered with the erection of the Washington Monument. John Quincy was down in that canal one morning taking a swim. He was an early riser, just like I am. An old lady went down and sat on his clothes because she wanted a job, and she hadn't been able to get it.
Did she get it that time, Mr.
I understand that she did. Then on the north wall, we have James K. Polk and Martin Van Buren.
I wonder about this seal on the rug, Mr. President. If we step back, people might be able to take a look at it. That's again the presidential seal. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the presidential seal, and that's the new seal.
The one that you had designed.
That's right. The eagle's facing to the north, and we have the olive branch, and we have the 48 stars around the outside of it.
How about this mantle over here, Mr. President?
That's one of the Adam mantles. That's one of the old ones.
One of the original from...
One of the original. It's been in the White House ever since it was first built.
Incidentally, the green room, as I recall, is the only one of these rooms that has a color in its name that's always been that color. Is my understanding right?
I don't know for sure. That's what I've been told, but I can't pose as an authority on that.
I was also talking to your daughter a while ago, Mr. President. She tells me that this chandelier up here is one that was bought, I believe, by Mrs. Coolidge in the flea market in Paris. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding, yes.
Sort of a bargain that she picked up over there?
It's a beautiful thing. It's a very beautiful chandelier. All the chandeliers on this floor are lovely.
Mr. President, might we take a look at the East Room now?
Yes. Somebody stepped on the trigger and put his light out.
This, I guess, is the largest room in the White House, isn't it, Mr. President?
Yes, this is the ballroom. This is where all the people assemble when we have state receptions. And then they march through the green room to the blue room, and then to the red room, then to the state dining room where they have refreshments.
Isn't this also where the people who come personally to the White House for a tour of the public room, this is where their upstairs tour begins?
This is where the tour begins, in the East Room. We're ending up where they usually begin. This is a picture of George Washington we're before now. It's an imitation steward. I understand that it's not a real steward.
But Gilbert Stewart?
Yes, but I'm not sure about that. Some people say the steward painted the face and one of his hired help painted the rest of the figure. At any rate, Dolly Madison is credited with having saved it when the British burned the house.
Well, that's the one that she cut down and tucked under her arm and ran out the door with, Mr. President?
Well, that's the story, but that story isn't true. She took the frame, picture, and all, and took it away in a big wagon. But the story has always gone around that she cut the picture out of the frame, rolled it up, and put it under her dress, and took it with her. And one of the quiz kids one time asked President Roosevelt what sort of a knife she used to cut the picture out of the frame. And Mr. Roosevelt told me that he didn't hesitate a minute. He said, why, kitchen knife, of course.
This piano over here, Mr. President, seems
It's
to
a
be
wonderful Steinway piano. It's a beautiful piano and has one of the most wonderful tones of any piano I've ever heard.
You have a piano, I guess, in your study. Do you
Yes.
ever play the pianos in the public rooms, Mr. President?
Hardly ever.
I wondered if you would mind if I just hit a note of this piano so people can tell what a White House piano sounds like.
I'll show them what it sounds like.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Well, we have another piano up here, too, that's a good one. That was presented to the new White House by an American piano company, the Baldwin people.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lovely piano, too, in a mahogany case with silver trimmings, has a seal on the outside, and it also has a beautiful tone.
It's very fair to play both pianos, Mr. President.
Well, that's a beautiful piano. Both of them are. Sometime or other, I'm hoping to have a reception and have a two-piano concert here by a couple of the world's great pianists. I'm sure we'll have that one of these
Do you
days.
think you can do that while you're still in the White House, Mr. President? Is that something to look forward to?
I can't do it any other time. I'm going to do it before I move out.
Mr. President, another thing about the East Room that I've heard, and I think you're the source of the story, is that Abigail Adams hung her wash in here before it was finished.
That's correct. If you read the life of Mrs. John Adams, Abigail Adams, it states there that the floor was not in the East Room when the Adamses moved in. They moved in 1798. The house was started in 1792. It wasn't finished by 1798. It was almost as slow a job as the one we just finished.
And so there was nothing to do with the room but use it as a laundry drying room, then, I suppose.
Well, that's what she used it for, but they finally finished it. And it's always been the state ballroom and the place for receiving the people who are here for diplomatic receptions and things of that sort.
Haven't there also, Mr. President, been some famous weddings in the East Room here?
Yes. One of the Wilson girls was married here. Alice Roosevelt was married in this room. And there's another, one of the White House daughters was married here, who my recollection is bad, but it's also been used for funerals. President Roosevelt's lay in state here, and President Harding, and nearly all the presidents who died in office have been lay in state here in this room.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, if we can take a look.
May 3rd, 1952. Isn't that something? It's now 1952 campaign in full swing. I thought I would run advertisements for both candidates and maybe see who your preference would be. So, for the Democratic side,
I'd rather have a man with a hole in his shoe than a hole in everything he says. I'd rather have a man who knows what to do when he gets to be the prez. I love the governor of Illinois. He is the gov that brings the dove of peace and joy. When Illinois, the GOP double-crossed, He is the one who told all the crooks, get lost. Adley, love you madly. And what you did for your own great state, you're gonna do for the rest of the 48. Didn't know much about him before he came, but now my heart's a ballad that bears his name. 'Cause I listened to what he had to say. I know that on election day we're gonna choose the gov that we love. He is the gov nobody can shove. We'll make the gov the president of the you, the me and the USA.
Kudos that they could find something to rhyme with Adley.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John
or Dean
or Harry, let's do that big job right. Just get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country. Vote for Eisenhower.
And perhaps some of you had or have family or friends who worked in a steel mill. Now, me being from Western Pennsylvania, I certainly had family who worked in a steel mill who, growing up, when and where I did, this was a big topic of conversation in my family history when the Truman administration tried to take over the steel mills. I very much remember when my uncles would talk about this. And the fundamental constitutional question: can a president of the United States, can an executive have that authority? How much power does a president of the United States have? Was Truman a man of steel? How much power does a president have? You can see a cartoon there. Was Truman right? Or did he overreach? Maybe you'd like to share your thoughts in the chat. Truman did what he thought was right. He was thinking big picture and long game. With this executive order, much like he was thinking with the railroad strike back in 1946, he was concerned about the overall economic health of the country. But I wanted to share with you one of my all-time favorite letters from the entire Truman administration. Truman was absolutely floored and stunned when the federal judiciary started to rebuke him and his executive order and blocking his executive order. And Truman was absolutely stunned when it was ultimately the Roosevelt and Truman Supreme Court that delivered the ultimate rebuke. And so this incredible letter from July 9th of 1952, where President Truman writes to Justice William O. Douglas, where he says that, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to talk to you. Where he says, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to discuss precedents with you before you came to the conclusion about that crazy decision. But the one paragraph that really intrigues me is where he says, I'm writing a monograph on just what makes justices on the Supreme Court tick. There was no decision by the majority, although there were 7 opinions against what was best for the country. I don't see how a court made up of so-called liberals could do what that court did to me. I'm going to find out just why before I quit this office. This letter just absolutely intrigues me. And this letter takes me back to something that we talked about in one of the earlier sessions with this program series, back to when we were talking about when President Truman was serving on the county court here in Jackson County, Missouri, back when President Truman was briefly attending a law school here in Jackson County. President Truman did not graduate from the law school here, but the surviving records, the work that he was doing, shows I think President Truman would have made, I think, a very sharp and a very keen lawyer. So when Truman writes in this letter, I'm writing a monograph here on what makes the justices of the Supreme Court tick. I think that would have made a fascinating book, a fascinating monograph. Unfortunately, I've never really seen any evidence that he really did anything with this. But yeah, presidents at odds with what the Supreme Court was doing. It's nothing new. Fascinating part of the political dynamic. October 24th, 1952, candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower, in a speech, one of thousands of words in the speech, 5 words, he says, I shall go to Korea. Those 5 words helped change the dynamic of the election. Now, it's likely that Eisenhower was going to win anyway, but those words really do change the dynamic. And those words, in addition to the kerfuffle over the McCarthy flap and the McCarthy and George Marshall flap, really irritate Truman no end and help cause that rift between Truman and Eisenhower. But I shall go to Korea. Do you think that those words would have influenced your vote in 1952? Perhaps if you had a loved one as part of the Korean conflict. My parents were both serving in the Korean conflict. And I wonder how my family felt about that. And so the nation voted. And there's the electoral map. And you can see the Eisenhower landslide nationally in Missouri. You can see Jackson County here on the left side. It remained Democratic. But you can see the big difference over some of the previous maps from Missouri that I've shown you in some of our previous sessions. Missouri had changed. It was an Eisenhower landslide. Some said it was inevitable after so many years of Democratic control, that the nation might have been ready for a change. But one thing that was probably stinging to President Truman was what he saw in this headline from the Kansas City Star on November 5th of 1952, was this headline where it said that Truman was a drag. That must have hurt. This photograph made the rounds. After a presidential election, we talk about transitions, and Harry Truman helped set the precedent for orderly transitions. He really believed that it was the responsibility for an outgoing president of the United States to make an orderly transition for the continuity of government. And so he did everything that he possibly could to make that transition orderly. But if photographs could talk, if we could jump into that photograph, I wonder what it would say. It would take several years for that relationship to heal. It wouldn't be until November of 1963 for that relationship to heal. We'll be talking about that next month. A few weeks after that election, the President of the United States lost his mother-in-law, and the First Lady lost her mother. Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace died on December 5th of 1952. A grand lady, the President of the United States described his mother-in-law as. Madge Gates Wallace was born just a few days before the Battle of Antietam in the American Civil War. And to think about that, she was born in the middle of the Civil War and lived into the atomic age and the age of television and the age of flight, and lived to see her son-in-law become president of the United States, and lived to see her daughter First Lady of the United States. She lived to be 90 years old. And a few days after Madge Wallace died in the White House in Washington, D.C., Madge Gates Wallace was brought home by train to Independence, Missouri. A brief Episcopal funeral was held in the parlor, the music room inside of her home at 219 North Delaware Street. And then her body was taken by motorcade down to Woodlawn Cemetery, and she was laid to rest beside her family, her parents, in Woodlawn Cemetery. And I just wanted to share with you just a page from the Secret Service trip report. Madge Gates Wallace lived to be 90 years old. I just can't stop thinking about Madge Wallace. Really a remarkable lady. A lot has been theorized about the relationship between Madge Wallace and her son-in-law. A lot of it we just simply won't know for a fact. There's a page on our website that I encourage you to take a look at, where one of our rangers, a fellow by the name of Jeff Wade, consolidated all of the resources that we have and gives you the opportunity to look at all of these resources and allows you to come up with your own conclusion as to the relationship that Madge Wallace had with President Truman based on all of these resources. She is a remarkable lady and a person very, very much worth researching. And she is one of my favorite people to read about, Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace. And the family gathered in the White House for one last Christmas, 1952, and I love this photograph. It was a bittersweet one for them without Mrs. Wallace. But there they are, one last Christmas in the White House, 1952. And of all of those people around the table, only one of them is left, this gentleman there on the right looking at the camera. That's Mr. David Wallace. This book he just published a few years ago called I Call Him Uncle Harry. It's a wonderful memoir. And it's a very good read. Again, I Call Him Uncle Harry. Very well worth finding. And so there's a Gallup consolidation of President Truman's popularity rating. And so it's commonly told that, yes, indeed, when Harry Truman left the White House in January of 1953, that his approval ratings were hovering, depending on who was taking the poll, between 20 and 35%. And so, yes, that there was one primary in New Hampshire in which Harry Truman came in second place. And so the theory was that he probably would not have received the nomination had he run in 1952. So his approval ratings were not very high. But then again, after Eisenhower's inauguration in 1953, he was greeted very warmly as he left Independence. And as he was coming home, well, I'll let this video speak. Courtesy of our friends at the National Archives.
And after the inauguration was over, which was consummated by the Chief Justice of the United States, I immediately went back, got in my car, and went out to Dean Aitchison's house, where we had a wonderful luncheon, and then went down to the station to leave town. And you never saw such a turnout at the station. It was estimated by the Washington police that there were 9,000 people there. And I think maybe they were, because it took 2 or 3 Secret Service men and a lot of policemen to get me up to the train.
If the Republicans were glad to see Truman go, they appeared to be in the minority.
You know, they're very, very willing to raise a lot of noise and greet you when you're on the way up. But when you're on the way out, it's a little different thing. And this turned out to be one of the most magnificent things that ever happened to me. They were there to see a fellow who had served 8 years in the White House leave town, which is not very usual. Well, that happened all the way across the country, from Washington until we got to Independence, Missouri. And it was heartwarming, the way that people acted.
Truman had conferred with rulers and leaders of nations. Now, suddenly, he was relegated to the level of John Jones.
He'll always be Mr. President to us. He's home folks to us. We're glad to have him, and we're glad to have all of you here to greet him tonight. Welcome home, neighbors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I can't tell you how very much Mrs. Truman and I appreciate this reception. It is magnificent. I never expected it. Therefore, it's more to the heart than I anticipated it would be. There's not much that I can say to you, except that your good feeling and your thought of us is always highly appreciated. We're back home now for good. I'm in the army of the unemployed now, although it's a very small army, and I'm here to tell you that a little later on, when I get the job done that Mrs. Truman has for me, which she says I'm going to have to do, that's to unpack all our goods and chattels,
And it took about 7 or 8 men 3 months to get it done, so I don't know how long it's going to take one man to get it undone. After that, I'll be open for dinner engagements and things of that kind, because I may be hungry for that time. We do thank you immensely for this wonderful welcome. I don't see how anybody in the world could have a better one. Thank you very much.
And one of my favorite stories is that after Eisenhower became president for the first time since April of 1945, Harry S. Truman in an automobile had to stop at a red light because he was now Mr. Citizen. So what do we do with former presidents? They said he was retired. Well, this guy, this one, he built a presidential library, wrote 2 volumes of a best-selling memoir, published another one about being Mr. Citizen. He starred in a 26-episode television series, campaigned for Democrats across the country, and continued his association with the Masons, became a father-in-law and a grandfather, and spent the rest of his life with the love of his life. And it's all of this that I would like to tell you about next month as we gather for the grand finale of our guided tour of Truman, as we talk about the last 19 years of Harry Truman's life, those last years when we talk about Harry Truman, the elder statesman, which is a phrase that Truman really didn't like, but I think it's a very good description of Harry Truman in those last years of his life. So Thursday, December 7th, 2023, 2:00 p.m. I hope that you will join us for that. And so I want to thank all of you for being with us today. And how are we doing, Beth? Do we have anybody in the chat?
Anyone have questions or anything they would like to add before we sign off? We just appreciate you all being along for the journey. And thank you, Doug, as always, for the wonderful material. Yes,
very welcome. I'm grateful to all of you for being here today and being with us on this journey through Truman.
All right. Brilliant.
Thank you, Beth, as always. Thank you, Mid-Continent.
Yeah. Well, it looks like everyone is signing off slowly but surely, so we will go ahead and end, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Be safe. Stay warm.